Okay, I am going to share screen, and I have 3 screens, so I'm going to need to rely on you to tell me that I've got the right one up. You should be seeing 2 pictures. Okay, so I didn't know until it was too late, but my grandmother used to see spirit. She moved into a house and she started seeing an old lady and just walking around in the house, and she mentioned it to the vicar, and he said, oh yes, that was Mrs. Smith who used to live here when she died. And when my grandmother was young, she was quite ill a lot, and she would see this beautiful white hand floating around her bed, and she wasn't afraid of it at all. She thought it was wonderful. So she obviously, had some mediumistic skills or gift, whatever you call it. When my mother was very young, about 4 years old, my grandmother used to have spiritualists come to the house. My mother was terrified of them, and she told me that she used to hide under the table. So when I was 7, my mother became a Jehovah's Witness, and they really play on that because their teaching is that any contact with the spirit world is demonic. You've got the demons if you contact the spirit world. So that's how I was raised, unfortunately, and I passed that fear and teaching along to my 3 children. My oldest, Jennifer, never listened to anything I said, like many young people. And when she was a young teenager, I was terrified to find out that she had brought a Ouija board into the house and was communicating with a spirit who called himself or itself Zulp. In fact, using Jennifer's hand, the spirit wrote a note. And when I saw that, I just freaked out and made her get rid of the Ouija board. But this is, I actually still have this note. When she was 9 months old, Jennifer had a fall from her crib. And I took her to the doctors, and they all said she seemed fine, but not long after that, her behavior started to change, and she had terrible screaming tantrums every day. She would lie on her back and scoot around the floor and just follow me around, screaming her head off, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I would take her to doctors, numerous different ones, different times, but it wasn't until she was 10 years old that I finally found someone who tested her properly and psychologically. And the result was that the fall from her crib had caused a closed head injury. So it's a head injury. You can't see physically that anything's wrong, but the behavior is wrong. And the way it manifested was she was just not able to fully understand the consequences of her actions or to learn from her mistakes. And so she got into all kinds of difficult things. And when she was 10, things got really bad when she threatened one of her brothers with a knife. And after that, she went into a residential behavioral program for 3 months, which was very painful for all of us. And that's apparently where she was introduced to drugs. And as she got older, lots of bad things happened. When she was 13, she told me she knew she was going to die before she was 18. She just insisted on it, but she made it to 27. Going back to when she was about 2, we moved into a house where she had her own room. She was the only child at that time, but she didn't want to be in that room, in that bedroom. She'd come to me all the time crying, "There's a goose in my room, there's a goose in my room." And I just didn't know what to do or what she was talking about. And believe it or not, it was only a few years ago that it occurred to me that maybe what she was saying was, "There's a ghost in my room." Because she developed a strong interest in the spirit world. And even 2 months before her death, she drove 90 miles to go with me to see the movie The Sixth Sense. We all remember that one. And while we were watching the movie, she kept sneaking looks at me to see how I was taking it. By then, I had been excommunicated, disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witness organization. Thank God, my spirit guides got me out of there. My mother stopped associating with me, and now she's almost 92 and she still doesn't speak to me. But that left me free to start broadening my areas of interest. And so I started going to psychics. The very first one, I've forgotten her name, but she was in Palm Springs. She talked about Jennifer, who was giving me a lot of trouble. And she said, she's like a wounded animal in the woods. You either have to find a way to save her or shoot her. And of course, she meant it metaphorically, but you know, I would call her words eerily prescient. Jennifer was very close to her two younger brothers, Eric and Ben, which this is 20 years ago. They're in their 40s now, and they don't look quite the same. But when she was 26, a friend of hers introduced her to his brother, Tom Schnabel, who was 34. And Tom was a federal agent who worked for what is now known as Homeland Security, but then was the Department of Immigration and Naturalization and Services, the INS. He was a special agent for the INS. And it was one of those karmic connections, you know? Within 2 weeks, he wanted to move in with her. Well, he was still married, and she wouldn't allow him to move in with her until he had filed for divorce, which he did. And he had a 9-year-old daughter that he was very close to, but the wife, out of revenge or whatever, took the child and moved to Boston. So that was a stressor for Tom. He was very close to her two younger brothers, Eric and Ben, which this is 20 years ago. They're in their 40s now, and they don't look quite the same. But when she was 26, a friend of hers introduced her to his brother, Tom Schnabel, who was 34. And Tom was a federal agent who worked for what is now known as Homeland Security, but then was the Department of Immigration and Naturalization and Services, the INS. He was a special agent for the INS. And it was one of those karmic connections, you know? Within 2 weeks, he wanted to move in with her. Well, he was still married, and she wouldn't allow him to move in with her until he had filed for divorce, which he did. And he had a 9-year-old daughter that he was very close to, but the wife, out of revenge or whatever, took the child and moved to Boston. So that was a stressor for Tom. You know, what do you do when your mom is a handwriting analyst and you have a new boyfriend, or in the case of my son's, a new girlfriend? Well, obviously you bring home a handwriting sample. And that's what she did. She sent me a sample. And he was very interested too. He wanted to know what it said about him. And when I saw his handwriting, I will say my heart dropped. And you can even see the little Post-it note that I had left for myself that said there was potential for explosive behavior. Now, as I've said, Jennifer had some major behavioral problems. Today, therapists would call it oppositional behavior disorder. But basically what it means is she wouldn't listen to anyone but herself. When she was 25, I believe she was 25, 26, she called me and she said, "I don't hate you anymore," which to me was her way of saying, "I love you." But she also said, "Since I was 6 years old, I always knew what was best for me. You should have let me make my own decisions and do what I wanted." So I explained to her why that didn't work for me, because, you know, being her mom, it was not my job to let her just do what she wanted. But there were only 3 areas where Jennifer and I got along well, and that was cats. We both love cats, with cooking, and with tarot cards, because by now I'd learned how to read tarot cards. And she had a big interest in that. And between us, we had about 20 decks, so we could talk about that without having an argument. Now, Tom's handwriting that you see here, it's actually very, very light pressure, and I had to enhance it so you could see it properly on the screen. And what it reveals is that not only was he an authoritarian personality type who liked to make rules for others. In other words, he was the type of person who would say, "Do as I say, not as I do." But there were also indications of a head injury. And handwriting can give some very interesting indicators for physiological issues. And I asked him if he'd had a head injury, and he said, yes, I was hit on the head so hard on the job that I was almost blinded. And he was seeing a doctor for terrible headaches that he was having. And that was bad enough. So they both had a head injury, but they also both had alcohol issues, and they both had a lot of stress on the job. She was working for the Department of Protective Children's Services. That's not the right name, but you get the idea. And of course, he was in the INS. With all that stress and stress at home, I saw this as an explosion waiting to happen. He would bottle up his emotions until they burst out. He had very strong emotions. I told him, don't try to control her, because I never could. And if you try, things are going to turn out badly. But of course, she had never listened before. And so he moved into her apartment. And very shortly after, he was calling me on the phone to complain about her, and she was calling me to complain about him. And I tried to counsel them, but they continued having a lot of rows. He was never physically abusive, but he was verbally abusive. And I tell their story a lot at lectures I speak. Up until this year, I was giving about 50 talks a year. And I always bring up their story because I hope it'll help someone when I explain, physical abuse is not the only kind of abuse. And if somebody is verbally abusing you or emotionally, like he would keep her up all night, accusing her of things that she hadn't done, then it's not going to get better. You have to get out. So they used to come up to our house for meals. I was married at the time. And we liked him. He seemed fine. But I didn't know that he had showed my husband his gun that he carried around with him. And he told him that he liked this gun because it had good stopping power. I didn't know he was going to use it to stop my daughter. Jennifer thought it was funny when he would pull the gun out in traffic and in road rage and brandish it at other motorists. She had her own gun, which didn't help. So in December of 1999, around Christmas, some bad things happened between them, and she ended up being put into a mental hospital for observation because Tom told the doctors that she was suicidal, which was not true. But he was a federal officer, so they listened to him. Well, she got out, and they went into group therapy, and the therapist thought that everything was her fault because, she was the crazy girl and he was the federal officer. His bosses got involved, and they told Tom that he had to split up with her or lose his job, which didn't happen. And 2 months later, on the evening of February the 18th, 2000, my husband Bill and I were out to dinner at our favorite restaurant, and Jennifer gave me a phone call, and she asked me if I would do some small favor for her. And I said, sure, of course, but we're out to dinner right now. Can I talk to you about it tomorrow? And she said, yes, that's fine. Well, the next morning, I was getting ready to go to a forensics conference in Las Vegas. I was a forensic handwriting examiner. And around 11:30 that morning, my cell phone rang. I answered it, and I didn't catch the name or title of the person on the other end of the line. And he said, is Kenneth Lowe there? Well, Kenneth Lowe was my first husband and the father of my 3 children. And I said, why are you calling him on my cell phone? We've been divorced nearly 20 years. He said, do you know Jennifer Lowe? Well, remembering that she'd recently been in the mental hospital, I thought maybe something had happened and she was back there. I found out later that the caller was investigator Joe Holmes of the Orange County Sheriff's Office. But at that moment, what he said was, and I quote, I'm sorry to tell you, but your daughter's been murdered. So I knew right away that it was Tom, but I didn't know at that time that he had also turned the gun on himself. I just stared at the phone and I said, this can't be true because you don't tell somebody that on a cell phone. What if I had been driving? And I called my husband and he talked to investigator Holmes. There's really no good way that you can give that kind of news. And they were trying to get to me before the news did, because I got calls from LA Times and numerous others. The TV show Extra came out and a little later and did a 5-minute profile on what had happened. So let's fast forward to a day or two after she had been killed. That night, my office phone rang late at night. I have a home office. I answered it, and all I heard was a heavy static on the line with a very distant voice. I couldn't make out the words. I could just tell somebody far away was trying to reach me. Then the same thing happened with my cell phone, and I knew it was Jennifer. And I felt like, you know how when you go on a trip, you go far away on a journey, fly somewhere, and you call home and you say, I'm here, I made it safely. I believe that's what she was doing. Then, 3 days after her death, I drove the 90 miles south to Lake Forest to meet up with my sons and with Ken, her father, to close up her apartment. And when I got there, Tom's brother and father were there to pick up his things. And they were just standing there off to the side together, not knowing what to do. So I went over and hugged them, and we all cried. Because my daughter was murdered, but their son and brother was a murderer, and that's even worse. So there were many signs in those early days as I began to read everything I could about the afterlife. Eventually they got fewer and farther between, but I still get them sometimes, and I'm going to show you one. On that day that I went to close the apartment, I picked up Jennifer's 2 cats from where they were being held at the animal shelter. I had her other 2 cats, these 2 here, Fritz and Sugar. Those were her first babies. And then little Charlie here, you can just see his butt. Charlie and Victor were living with her, and I went and picked them up at the animal shelter, and they put them in a box, and I took them in my car. My brother had agreed to adopt these 2, and he lived in Riverside, which was another 60 miles east of Lake Forest. So it was late on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, like I think it was about 5:30 or 6 in February, and it's raining. I'm driving out there on the freeway, and I was feeling pretty bad, as you can imagine. I had her wedding gown in the back of my car that I planned to bury her in, but that's another story. As I was driving, I was surprised that the 2 cats were being completely silent, because when I would take Fritz and Sugar in the car, they always made plenty of noise. All of a sudden, the interior dome light came on in the car, and it had never done that before, and it never did it again. And I knew Jennifer was there, and that was why the cats were quiet. Then, on Friday of that week at the funeral, my husband and I were walking up the hill behind the hearse to the burial site. And when we got there, my sons and my brother-in-law and the other pallbearers were taking the casket from the hearse, when all of a sudden there was this loud beep, beep, beep. It was my brother-in-law's car alarm. He wasn't touching the keys. It stopped. And again, I knew Jennifer was there with us. Now, just last year, I asked her for a sign. I mean, I've had signs variously, but I asked her for a sign that she was still around. Oh, I want to talk about these first. Phone calls, I talked about that. I said the smell of flowers. One day I walked into my office not long after she died, and a certificate that had been on the wall for quite a few years jumped off by itself. The radio would change stations by itself. I had a tape deck switch to the CD player from a tape to CD, and it started playing the song Storm at Sunup by Gino Vanelli. And one amazing thing was I saw her very clearly walk past the kitchen door. So about a year after her death, I went to a conference that Gary Schwartz and his then wife, Linda, were sponsoring at the University of Arizona in Tucson, an afterlife conference. On the second day, everybody was out to lunch. And when we returned, I was the first person in the room. I was in the room by myself. And I heard very clearly her voice outside my ear saying, "Mom, Mom." So that, I felt like that was very cool. Well, I became a medium junkie. I wanted to know everything I could. You know, I started reading all the books, all the standard books, and I had some amazing sessions with some of the best mediums. And this was a picture from last February when we were at the gravesite 20 years later. Oh, this is, before I talk about the mediums, I'll tell you about this sign from last year. I had asked her to let me know if she was still around. I said, give me a sign, let me know if you're around. Well, nothing happened. And a couple of days later, I was going to a meeting of my professional women's organization. And at the back of the room, we have a table where we put samples of our wares. Like I put my books back there. And we had a new member, and she had some little wooden signs. And there was this one. And I said, oh, I have to get that because my daughter was a huge fan of mermaids. She had this big poster that's now in my living room and a lot of little statuettes. So I'm going to get that. And when I got home, I thought, oh, she sent me a sign. And it's a literal sign made out of wood. That's so cool. And it really was. So I sent an email to the woman who had, that I bought it from, and I told her what happened. And I didn't know her. I didn't know what she thought about the afterlife. But she emailed me right back and she said, I just got goosebumps because I was in my car ready to go to the meeting. And I remembered I wanted to wear some earrings to show, you know, the earrings that she made. So I went back in the house to get them. And on my way out, I passed the table where I had been working that day making these signs. And I thought I should take that one with me. So I thought that was really pretty cool. So I became a medium junkie. I was picked out of 1,000 people with John Edward 3 months after her death. James Van Praagh came to my house and taped a show, and I know that she arranged that for my birthday because of the way it all happened. And all of these are only a few of the mediums. These are the really, you know, the big ones. Even as late as last year, Suzanne Giesman, who is booked years ahead, was kind enough to read a book I'd written that I'm going to tell you about. And she invited me to be on her radio show, and we ended up exchanging services. I analyzed her handwriting, and she gave me a fantastic reading with Jennifer. Now, one of these mediums, Chris Meredith, is in San Diego, and I started going to him about a year after Jennifer was killed, and I found he was really right on with the proof that he brought through. And one day, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe 10 years, maybe more, probably around 10 years ago, I drove down to see him. And I took with me a brand new cassette tape for him to record on. It was still wrapped in the plastic cellophane. And I handed it to him, and I watched him unwrap it and put it in the tape player. He did the reading, he gave it back to me. And I started on my journey home. It's about 250 miles, 200 miles then, something like that. When I put the tape in the player, I got something that I never expected to get right at the beginning. It's about a half second long. I'm going to play it for you. But it's not Chris's voice. You can hear his voice come in afterward. Oh, darn it, I forgot to share sound. So I'm gonna turn this up really loud. And if you can't hear it, I'll unshare and then share sound with you. Here we go. Wait, that was the wrong one. But, was that loud?
Yes.
Okay.
We could hear that.
Okay, I'm going to play it again. To me, it sounds like I think. Oops. Go back. And then you can hear his voice. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's a voice from our world. I don't think it's a human voice. I sent it to somebody, this was long before I knew about AREI, but I found somebody who did work in this area, and she sped it up, and then it sounded like this. Like mommy. So that was another proof to me that she was around. Now, as a writer of both nonfiction and mystery suspense fiction, I always thought that I should write a book about Jennifer's life and death, but it was always too hard. I mean, I even have a title. I'm going to call it Growing from the Ashes, but I haven't done it. I've written lots of articles about her, and I've given lots of talks about her. But 2 years ago, I started thinking about it again. My boyfriend, the man I was seeing, died suddenly 3 years ago of a heart attack. And so that had kind of reawakened my interest in the afterlife and got me going again. So it occurred to me that I could write a book about the world of spirit, but it could be fiction. And then, over a period of a few months, 3 different mediums that I saw independently mentioned the book and told me that Jennifer would be working on it with me. And I said, that is really great, because she's very smart. And then I realized that the main character needed to be a young woman I had written about several years before in a book called What She Saw. And in that book, this young woman has amnesia. But in the continuation of her story 5 years later, she's been trying all this time to ignore the spirit voices she's been hearing. But she becomes dragged into a case of a missing child, and she can no longer ignore the voices. So I started writing the book, and Jennifer definitely worked with me, at least on parts of it. I always wished that she would make it easier. It was still really, writing a book is hard. But there were things, there was, for example, there was a scene where this young woman, whose name is Jessica, has a dream, or is it a dream, you know, kind of thing, where she goes to hell. And when she wakes up, there's a cross on her hand, I think it was a black cross. Anyway, I didn't really put anything more about that. And when I sent the book to my publisher, I was hoping they'd forget about it, but they noticed it and said, well, whatever happened about that? And I thought, oh, okay. And I said, Jennifer, help me. How can I resolve that? And almost instantly, I got like a download of what to do, and it was perfect, how to resolve that. And then in a scene, near the beginning of the book, I was writing a scene where Jessica's walking along the beach, when all of a sudden, this man that I was seeing, who had died, wanted to come into the scene. And he used to ride his bicycle on the beach. And he came riding up in this scene. And I said, okay, you got to have a reason for being there. And then he came back later in another scene and he wanted to be there. And I said, Arnie, if you're going to be in the book, there has to be a good explanation for it. And again, immediately I got a really good reason for him to be there that helped the book along. And then I had help on this side of the veil with our own wonderful Wendy Zamet, who helped me with a seance scene that afterwards a bunch of mediums read it and said that it was just like being there, it was realistic. So Suzanne Giesman wrote a beautiful cover blurb, and so did Gary Schwartz and Sandra Champlain and several others. Well, of course, that's then going back to 2017 is when I became involved in AREI, and I went to the symposium in Scottsdale, and there I met Sonia Rinaldi. I wanted to advance this to wrap up here. So I became part of Sonia's group of 30 moms who had children on the other side. And I'm sure you all know about her work and how she's been getting pictures of people from the other side. Well, recently she did a new procedure, and she allowed Jennifer to be in it. And she got some phenomenal photos. So here's a photo that I sent of Jennifer in 2000. And then the others are her spirit self now. So here's 2000. And if you look at the eyebrows and the mouth, you can see it's the same person, but it's not the same picture. And I just think these are absolutely incredible pictures. And I'm glad to see, you know, she's still just as beautiful and happy. And I've been told that she is working with children who come over dramatically and helping them to over to the other side. So finally, in 2018, I went back to Scottsdale for the AREI, and there, I will never quite figure out how, I became the host of the Automatic Writing and Mediumship group, and several of the members are here today, I'm happy to see. We are a discussion group, not a class, and we meet on the first and third Wednesdays of each month at 5:30 p.m. Pacific. We have over 100 people on the list who are interested, but we usually get between 12 and 20 people come and go as they can. And you are all very welcome to join us anytime, share your experiences, come and go. We've got Michelle Szabo and Dennis Grego coming to be our guests from Voices Across the Veil. And by the way, I just had a really, really great reading a few weeks ago with a medium there. And we're having Barry Eaton, who was the guest speaker here in this group, I think it was last week or the week before. So here's my email address down at the bottom if you want to contact me, or it's my personal one is in the chat, SheilaLowe@roadrunner.com, and you could be added to the list. So that's my story.
And Sheila, thank you very much for sharing such a personal story and a tragic one.
Thank you for allowing me to. I hope it helps somebody in some way.
Sure.
Kathleen had a question. Did Jennifer's handwriting foreshadow what might happen in her future? Jennifer's handwriting was always a puzzle to me because it didn't show what the things that I thought it should. But after 50 years in the field, I should know better than that, because we can't, as a handwriting analyst, I can't tell the handwriting what to say. I have to listen to what it says to me. And I never saw in it, really, it was really odd, because I can see in plenty of other people's when there's been abuse and things like that. But I did not see it in Jennifer's, no.
Thank you, Sheila, for sharing this very moving story and with evidence. One thing that comes to my mind is, have you got any news from the guy, from Tom?
Yes.
Through Jennifer?
Well, he's come in several readings that I've had, especially over the last few years. And he's apologized. He looked on me like a mother because he didn't have a good relationship with his mother. And so he's showed up probably 4 or 5 times, and I've told him, you don't need to, it's okay. I never was angry. I understood what happened. But, I appreciate the apology. He said, I wasn't myself, because they'd both been drinking. Their blood alcohol was like twice the legal limit.
Wow.
So yes, he has come through.
Thank you very much, Sheila. It's quite a powerful story. I wanted to ask, you make forgiveness look easy. How did you manage it?
I think because I understood. And, I say this tongue in cheek, but the fact is, Jennifer was a nightmare growing up. And there were times I would have liked to kill her. But, I'm her mom, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not a killer. But she could drive you crazy. And so the two of them together, I knew it was an explosion waiting to happen. I didn't expect him to kill her. But I think that's why I was able to I didn't even need to forgive him. It was just, this is what happened and I understand it. But I understand that other people may not feel the same way. So, you just have to look into your own heart and know that whoever your person was put themselves into that position for a reason, and it didn't happen by chance. It's all part, I've recently been thinking of it, and I know this is not new to some of you, but as if we're on a stage playing a role, and when we're finished with this role, we go on to another one. So those people chose their roles. So really, there's nothing to forgive.